about a guy in Florida who had discovered an old Spanish galleon off the coast of Florida, and it was full of all kinds of treasure. Now that right there amazed me, because I thought to myself, I would think there were so many scuba divers off the coast of Florida that they would have had to put in, stoplights down on the ocean floor. And here this guy discovers this Spanish galleon full of gold and silver and jewels and all that kind of stuff down there. The very first load of treasure he brought up off the ocean floor was worth over $3 million. They suspect that by the time he's done bringing it all up, over $3 billion in money in that one ship down there. And here's the funny part. The last paragraph of the newspaper article said he has of yet not released the location of the ship. I thought, well, no, not unless he's governed a box of hair. Why would you tell everybody where it was? Because there's all kinds of paperwork and government stuff you got to do to get it. But Ozarkers, you can always grab our attention with a treasure story. We're all fascinated with treasure because there are so many Ozark treasure stories, you know. First of all, Missouri is a cave state, and caves immediately give you the idea that there might be gold or silver. This cave right over here, they looked for treasure in that cave, and they did find traces of Spanish explorers, because that was one alleged source of the gold and the silver, was the Spanish explorers. And by the way, if you come out here in the winter and stand right there and look down the holler, you can see where the White River ran right through here, which is where DeSoto used the White River as part of his highway system to get to and from. So we found Spanish explorer memorabilia in Marble Cave, but we didn't find any gold or silver. It made somebody a fortune, but that was because there was lots of bat manure down there, and he got $700 a wagon load for it, and that was a fortune in 1880. But anyhow, there's the source of the Spanish explorers. Then there were the Native Americans who had their own gold and silver jewelry, and that had to come from somewhere. And they had that when the Spanish explorers got here. And then there's the Trail of Tears, which I'll explain to you just a little bit. One of my favorite stories about treasure in the Ozarks, very local here to us, was a story that goes all the way back to 1800. And there were two men living up in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, folks, in 1800, the Louisiana Purchase hadn't been made yet. There was hardly anybody down here but a handful of Osage Indians and a few Delaware that had started moving in. No white men lived down here at all at that time, 1800. We didn't become a state until 1821. So, I mean, this was really a wilderness area down here along the White River. Well, these two men up in St. Louis, one of them is named Devereaux. He was a Frenchman, and his best friend was a black man named Buck Turner. And they were working for a shipping magnate over there in St. Louis, Missouri, who was running these barges and what do you call, rafts down the Mississippi River. You know, anybody that was farming in Illinois or over in Kentucky or northern Missouri, or fur traders coming across northern Missouri from the western reaches, came to St. Louis to ship their goods down the Mississippi, to put it on a big ship in New Orleans to sail around down toward the larger markets of either Europe or the eastern part of the United States. Well, those guys were making good money, because in 1800 in this country, if you were willing to work for wages, you could demand good pay, because it was too easy to make a living. I mean, the woods were teeming with wild game, the rivers were full of fish, you could go out and homestead your own land. Why would you work for somebody else? Well, if you were going to do it, you got paid pretty good money. Well, one evening, they were walking back. They had a room in a boarding house there in St. Louis, and as they were walking back to their boarding house, they heard a commotion over between two buildings in a little place back in there. They looked over, and here was this old Indian gentleman, just as sick as he could possibly be, coughing his head off and shivering with the cold. And they went over and gathered him up and took him back to their sleeping room and put him in bed and bathed his face and gave him water and put compresses on him. Well, I guess at some point during the night, the old man realized he wasn't going to make it, because he reached down into his clothes and he pulled out a silver medallion about that big around that he was wearing on a leather thong around his neck, and gave it to Buck Turner. Now, they tried to say, we don't want any pay, and he said, no, I want you to have that, and as a matter of fact, I'll tell you where my tribe mines its silver. Well, Devereaux, who was a highly educated man, grabbed his journal. He kept a journal on a daily basis and something to write with, and he wrote down the directions that this old Osage man gave him. He said first, and he sent him right down to this part of the country, he said, you must find a river that runs from northwest to southeast. It begins by gushing out of a limestone bluff, a very rapid, short river. You follow that river until it conjoins with a much larger river that runs from southwest to northeast. From the junction of those two rivers, you follow and he gave them directions to follow the summer sky, the stars, as they used for a navigation system, told how long, gave them the landmarks, how to find this cave where his tribe mined the silver. Well, sure as the world, by morning, the old man had passed on. So the two men, Devereaux and Buck Turner, they took care of his burial. But they took this journal entry and they took that silver medallion to the man who owned the shipping company there in St. Louis and showed it to him and said, "What do you think?" He said, "Well, I think I know what you boys have got in mind." And he said, "I tell you what, I will buy the supplies and grub stake you guys if you want to go down there and look for that cave. And if you find anything, we'll split it right down the middle." So he bought each of them a saddle horse. He bought a couple of pack mules, bought them tools, food supplies, and he packed these boys up and let them set off to come down here. Well, they started in the spring of the year, and they came down to this country, and it took them, oh gosh, a couple of months before they finally got on the track. But they found that river that comes gushing out of the limestone bluff, and they found the juncture of the two rivers, and they followed the skies. Then they hit a snag. And they looked and looked for weeks before they finally found the cave, because the Osage had pulled grapevines across the mouth of the cave and let it provide like a brush shield on the mouth of the cave. When they found it, and remember, Devereaux was writing in his journal every day, sometimes 3-4 times a day. He wrote in his description of the vein of silver in that cave as better than a foot wide and taller than a man's head stands. Can you imagine the silver in there? They set up camp immediately, and they started taking that silver out of the cave. And there was a little platform outside of the cave there that looked down over one of the rivers. And they would sit out there in the evening, and they had those little miner's picks, you know, with a short handle, and they would break down that silver ore to purify the silver as best they could. Well, they'd been at it for a while, and they had about 100 pounds of this reduced silver ore, and it was hot, of course. So they let their cook fire out on this little platform burn down till it was just nothing but embers, very likely even threw dirt over the embers. And Buck Turner tapped Devereaux on the shoulder and said, "We're not alone." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look over there across the river, see that?" And there was a little light blinking back in the woods. And all it could be was another campfire over there. And Devereaux said, "Who do you think that is?" He said, "I think that's the people who own this cave. And they're letting us mine the silver, but they have no intention of letting us ride off with it." So Devereaux said, "Maybe we should come up with a plan." So they did. They waited until they had a really good dark night, no moon, cloud cover, and they built the fire up on their little living room outside the cave there until it would take a while to act as a decoy. And they had the mules all packed and the horses saddled, and they slipped off in the dark of night trying to get away from those people that they knew were watching them. Now, the only trouble with that plan is that if you're not real familiar with the area and the night is that dark, there is no such thing as dead reckoning for a human being that I know of, and it's very, very easy to have your plumb bob go on this and drift off. And that is exactly what happened to Buck Turner and Devereaux. They began to drift farther and farther and farther west instead of going due north, which is what they hoped to do. They wound up over around where we think is Neosho, Missouri today, near the Neosho River. And they camped up on a little area that looked down on the river there. And any of you that are native campers or float trippers in the Ozarks, you know you never want to pitch your tent right down on the gravel bar next to the river. Because if a rain comes upstream, you can wake up in the morning watching your tennis shoes bob down the river. You want a little high place to get the river rise out of the way. And they had done that, and they let their campfire burn again, and Buck Turner tapped Devereaux on the shoulder and said, "You know what? We haven't fooled anybody. Look over there." And across the prairie, because up around the Osho, it starts to kind of flatten out. They could see a campfire right back there behind them. So Devereaux says, "Okay, now what's plan B?" He said, well, I think our chances are better if we split up. So each one of the men took one of the mules and 50 pounds of the silver ore. Each one took a horse, and they separated. Now, we don't know where Buck Turner went. We don't know, because in that day and age, it was illegal to teach a black man to read and write. He certainly was not keeping a journal. But Devereaux, we know, kept going north because he didn't know how far west he had traveled, you see, and he knows north is the answer. And he keeps going north until he gets up around where Lamar, Missouri is today. And he bumps into some fur trappers. And chances are he had even known them from the past because he had worked for that guy in St. Louis. And the fur trapper said, we can help you. And he put him on the trail that went right into St. Louis. And he said, all you got to do is stay right on this trail and follow the rising sun, and it'll take you right into St. Louis. So he was doing that, and he was making pretty good time. But the second day on that trail, he came across the body of his friend Buck Turner, shot full of arrows. Of course, the horse was gone, the mule was gone, the silver was gone. Well, Devereaux stopped, and he made camp there, and he buried his good friend. But that night, he was sitting there letting his campfire die and writing in his journal, and he walked away from the fire and looked around, and he saw about 3 of these little campfires blinking out there and realized that he was surrounded on 3 or 4 sides. So he sat down and he wrote into his journal, I don't think I will live to see the morning light. And he tore a page from out of the back of his journal, and he put it like this, and on top of that he put his Bible. He had a little pocket Bible he was traveling with, and on top of that he put that page he tore out of the journal, and he wrote, if found, please return to, and he wrote the man's name who had grub staked him back in St. Louis. And he tied that all together with a leather thong, I suppose, and slipped it down inside his jacket pocket. Well, sure as a whirl, about 2 days later, the fur trappers came through, and they found Devereaux's body where he had been killed there. And the horse was gone, and the silver was gone, and the mule was gone. They were honest enough that they took those books back to St. Louis and gave them to that man, who opened them up and read them and looked at them. But he said, you know, I'm not going to send more men down there to risk their lives, you know, for no reason. We don't know how good that silver was. We don't know how rich the ore was. So he tied those books together and laid it up on a shelf in his office. Now, for the next 150 years, we don't know where those books went, how often they were moved from the shelf in that office to a trunk somewhere else, or wrapped up in a blanket in Aunt Velma's attic someplace. But in 1965, somebody, one more person, took those books, untied them, looked at them, and this time had the presence of mind to take them to Washington University and have them translated. They were in French. Devereaux was a Frenchman. Even the Bible was written in the French language. Well, when the language department at the Washington University in St. Louis translated it, they then took their findings over to the Earth Science Department, who read it, and they said, well, shoot, we can find this. The stars haven't changed, and we've got all kinds of whiz-bangs and gizmos now that these guys didn't have. They came right back down here to the Ozarks, and they found that short river that comes gushing out of a limestone bluff. It's Roaring River, right over west of us here in Berry County. It was near Roaring River State Park was where it came gushing out of the bluff. And they followed that until it conjoined with the much larger river running from southwest to northeast. It was the White River. They followed the stars and they tracked the days, and they are pretty sure that they know the general area of where that cave with the silver is in it right now, but unfortunately it's under about 80 feet of Table Rock Lake. And we don't know how much silt on top of the cave. So if the silver was ever there, y'all get your scuba gear, because you might find it next week. There you go. Okay? Another Ozark tale of buried treasure.